Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
What's at stake in these do-or-die Brexit talks was starkly laid out today by the Chief Constable of the Northern Ireland Police Service. Simon Byrne told ITV News that imposing any kind of hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic could act as a recruiting tool for extremists. But he also said the border is impossible to police electronically. Peter Smith reports.
What to do with this border in Ireland is the conundrum that's given us the backstop and so far brought Brexit to a complete stop. The lack of a solution here is edging the UK toward no deal in exactly 10 weeks, and the Chief of Northern Ireland's Police is warning the consequences of that here will be profound. Public disorder and his officers under attack.
In terms of the likelihood of an increased attack on my office, it well could do. We've seen only this week a deliberate attempt to lure my officers into a very rural location and detonate a device that clearly had the potential to kill or seriously injure them. A hard Brexit with the potential of any form of border increases that risk, absolutely.
The meandering border in Ireland stretches 310 miles. It would be a headache to control, with over 300 crossing points. The world's longest border between America and Canada only has 119 crossings. It's also busy. More than 100 million journeys were taken across the border each way in 2017. The UK government has today reiterated it's committed to keeping physical checks away from the border. The Prime Minister believes there are electronic solutions. The PSNI Chief Constable disagrees. Can this be policed electronically?
No, it can't. I don't think it can, frankly. When you go into some of the rural communities where we're dealing with very small roads with a whole network of sort of different byways, that it's very easy to get around any sort of hard checkpoints. We couldn't do it 20 years ago with a lot of military support. We're not going to do it now.
The mere mention of military at this border harks back to the darkest days of Northern Ireland's troubles, when 3,500 people were killed. The old customs and checkpoints that were once a target for the terrorists here have now been closed for a long time. The Good Friday Agreement brought a kind of peace here because it allowed people in Northern Ireland to identify as British or Irish, and crucially, it made the border here invisible. The problem is, no-deal Brexit makes the invisible real again. With just 70 days to go now, politicians are still trying to figure out how you impose new checks and controls while keeping the border open and unchanged. Police here say they are now worried because even the most innocuous sign of a border is a target for attack. Peter Smith, ITV News, Belfast.
Let's talk to Angus Walker, who's at Westminster for us tonight. Angus, strong warnings from Northern Ireland, but will the Prime Minister be a little bit more optimistic about securing a Brexit deal now?
There is optimism, yes, I think that's the right word. The meetings were cordial. Downing Street officials pleased that Boris Johnson is now back in Downing Street, having had a hearing in two key European capitals. But they're also realistic that the Brexit positions of those EU leaders haven't fundamentally changed. They just think that there's a spark, perhaps the start of a process that could lead to tinkering with the backstop that could get this deal through Parliament. But what we've heard in Berlin and Paris does require a certain amount of interpretation. If you're a Brexiter, you see this as the first signs of the EU leaders heading towards their traditional last-minute compromise, caving in at the last minute, perhaps at the European summit in October, mid-October, just before we're due to leave. Others will say that the European leaders have called Boris Johnson's bluff, saying if you've got some bright idea on how to replace the backstop, well, off you go, let's see it. And we heard Emmanuel Macron talking about visibility today. The warnings from the Chief Constable in Northern Ireland putting it all into sober focus and underlining the fact that everyone is still trying to work for a deal.
Angus, thank you.
So, as we were discussing, next stop for Mr Johnson's diplomacy tour is indeed the G7 this weekend in Biarritz. And it's there that he will meet Donald Trump and try to get that momentum into that trade talks process. The US President has talked warmly of the prospects of a vast new trade deal in London, but there are some in Washington who've pledged to block any deal that undermines the Good Friday Agreement and threatens peace in Northern Ireland. One of those prepared to do so is Pennsylvania Congressman Brendan Boyle, co-chair of the Irish Caucus, who joins us now from Philadelphia. Congressman, welcome. What is your next step in trying to protect the Good Friday Agreement from this fairly imminent prospect of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I think that myself, as well as many of my colleagues in Congress, led by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, a large bipartisan group of us in the House of Representatives, have been quite clear that the top priority for us is the preservation of the Good Friday Agreement. This is the most successful peace process in decades. Sadly, there's not much competition for that title around the world, as most peace processes in my lifetime have failed. Here's one that, despite all of the odds, succeeded and has been, by and large, a successful 21 years. While we certainly don't have a total cessation of violence at the street level, I think anyone would have been amazed in 1997, 1998, if 21 years later we would have the sort of situation in Northern Ireland that we do today. So our perspective is that why in the world would we do anything to jeopardize this? Why in the world would we potentially attempt to unsettle things when we know that the police service of Northern Ireland head, when we know that international terrorism experts are all in single agreement that if you do have the reestablishment of a border, violence will follow.
But one thing that Boris Johnson has made absolutely clear yesterday in Berlin, today in Paris, and he said it again and again, we will not reintroduce a hard border. Now that should be a reassurance to you, shouldn't it?
Well, except the problem is how do you square the circle of the fact that you would now have two different jurisdictions? What makes it possible for the fact that Northern Ireland, still part of the UK, and the other 26 counties of the island of Ireland that compose the independent republic are part of this larger entity, the European Union. Once that goes away, for all sorts of reasons, there will need to be some sort of checks unless you have an agreement that puts them within the same jurisdiction, hence the backstop. You know, I am a bit perplexed because I don't remember even this conversation. While I'm far from a Brexit expert, I did follow that campaign in 2016, and I heard precious little about this rather obvious situation in which once you leave the European Union, the UK, you would now have two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. Unless you figure out something like the backstop, there would need to be some sort of a border, and that is the problem. It would violate the Good Friday Agreement, both the letter of the law and in spirit. And let's be clear, the United States cannot move forward with any sort of separate UK trade deal if we, as one of the guarantors of the agreement, the party that led the peace process when President Clinton appointed the former majority leader of the United States Senate, George Mitchell, to lead that process, we could not turn our back on it. We have bipartisan support, and you know, the reality is, and we've been quite blunt from day one, there will be no US-UK trade deal if the Good Friday Agreement is undermined, period.
How confident are you, though, about the numbers? Because, of course, in the Senate, there has been some lively support for the concept, and of course it's come from Republican senators. And I'm wondering whether this won't become another one of those vexed partisan issues on the Hill.
Well, historically, when it comes to Ireland and when it comes to U.S. diplomatic involvement in the peace process, it's actually been bipartisan. That certainly was the case in the 80s and the 1990s. The Friends of Ireland caucus that you mentioned is bipartisan. In the House, there is strong bipartisan support for this position. So I would be very surprised if this were to become a partisan issue. I believe the letter that 45 Senate Republicans sent that you're referring to had many things in it, by the way, that I could agree with. As an American, I would very much like to see a U.S.-UK trade deal. I believe that it's in both countries' interest when the U.S. and U.K. Is able to operate shoulder to shoulder. However, even that Senate Republican letter didn't take a position on the backstop. I think that if you saw the Good Friday Agreement undermined, a return to a border, a return to violence, the math clearly would not be there for a trade deal. One final point on this, because I think there might be some confusion. While the president and any president may negotiate a trade deal, it relies on it being passed in the House and the Senate. President Obama found that out in 2015, 2016, when over a 5-year period, he negotiated the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was rejected by Congress. It was not passed, and then it died. So there is actually precedent relatively soon in this.
Congressman Ball, thank you so much for joining us.